Yesterday, I took a little bit of time to speak about the one element or one portion of the what I call the not schizophrenic, bipolar nature of Sukkot, which is, as all the Jewish holidays do, they have a agricultural and historical element to it. Yesterday, we spoke about the agricultural element of it, in particular, its relation to the Arba Minim, to the four species, the lulav, the etrog, the willow, and the myrtle. And I thought that today, just very briefly, we would talk about the other element of it, which is the historical. And the Torah portion that surrounds the description, there are two descriptions of the holiday of Sukkot, one repeated after the other. And it reads as follows, that on the 15th day of the 7th month, which is this month, that you'll have the great ingathering, the great harvest. It should be noted that Sukkot was the first Thanksgiving. It's not just a Jewish Thanksgiving, it's the first Thanksgiving. As a kid growing up, I remember that many of the Sukkot would always be decorated with the familiar vegetables that people saw during the fall, and that was corn and gourds and things like that. It's interesting to note also that the story of the date of the secular Thanksgiving is one that has been ripe with much controversy and moving. In the States, of course, it's the third week in November. Here in Canada, it's the second week in October. Both of those debates, but particularly in the States, have been migrating issues over the course of many, many decades, in part reflective of exactly when the original harvest time was. We do know that in its earliest incarnations that the American Thanksgiving was celebrated much closer to when the Canadian Thanksgiving is, which is in October, vis-a-vis roughly around the time of Sukkot. And so the commandment outlines for us the story of the great harvest, and then it concludes like this. It says that for 7 days you will do the following. Yet you will sit in your sukkah. And why? In other words, that your generations will know that I led the Israelites through the desert in Sukkot over the course of the 40 years of their wandering in the desert. The ancient rabbis knew that verse very well, and they asked, what does it mean to dwell inside of a sukkah? And they famously answered by saying, Ke'en taduro, that you should dwell in the sukkah as you live in your house. And so what do? We eat in our sukkah because we eat in our homes, although actually people don't eat in their homes anymore. I'm going to go on a total tangent right now. There was an interesting study that the first cars that they had introduced cup holders in, I'm looking at Stephen Stark, he knows everything about cars. They were introduced roughly in the early 80s, which corresponded to an explosion in drive-thrus. People pulling up the drive-thrus. And now, overwhelmingly, car makers know most people eat their meals in their cars. Anyways, that's a whole other story. So, but people used to eat in their homes, used to eat with your family around you. And so we eat in the sukkah, because we eat in our homes. In climes that are warmer and more conducive to this, people would sleep in the sukkah, certainly in Israel. It's a very, very common thing. People socialize in the sukkah. And so you're supposed to live in it as one would live in their home, which then led me to the following question. There's a paradox, I think, embedded in this mitzvah, in the story of the sukkah. And that is, we go into the sukkah. Why? Because we're told that it is meant to remind us of the temporary nature of our own homes. And by extension, of our own existence. That we're supposed to leave the homes that we built for ourselves to move into this ramshackle hut to remind us of the temporality, of the finitude, of the gossamer nature of our own homes. That no matter how well they're built, no matter how strong the foundation is, we know that our homes are very much like us, and that is they eventually crumble and fall, right? And added to that, of course, is the idea that comes from the book of Ecclesiastes, which is also read on Sukkot. And Ecclesiastes, Kohelet turns and says to us that our own homes, in fact, are the things that are weak and fragile. That not just the sukkah is this fragile thing, but our own homes are a fragile thing. Which then begs the question, why don't we just stay in the sukkah? If everything is the same, broken and weak and gossamer, why don't we just stay in the sukkah? And of course, you know the answer. And that is the sukkah, while it is temporary, it's not good enough. Our homes we live in because they're good enough for us. The windows are nicer, the HVAC works, which begs the idea, I think, that our homes, while not permanent at all, that they're good enough. I'm reminded of the idea that came from the great book critic who used to run the New York Times literary edition. His name was Anatoly Broyard. And in the last column that Anatoly Broyard wrote, it's about 27 years ago, before he retired, he finished with this quote. It was his own, and I'm quoting him. He said, "There was a time when parents demanded nothing of their children except obedience. And yet now we ask everything of our children but obedience." There's a lot to unpack in Broyard's idea, but one in particular I want to share with you in relation to what I'm talking about, and that is, I seldom, over the 30 years that I have been working as a rabbi in Toronto, I have seldom worried about my congregation pushing themselves to succeed educationally, to succeed professionally, to succeed in business. I seldom, if ever, worry that they're going to be demanding of their children to also succeed professionally and succeed educationally. I don't worry about those things. But you know, concomitant with that, not just here in Beth Shalom and not just here in Toronto, but generally throughout the Western world now, there is now already an established trend amongst therapists and psychologists of people who are treating children and adults for burnout. And what is burnout the byproduct of? That people feel that they have to keep pushing themselves, that they have to keep achieving more and earning more and doing more. And it seems to me that one of the lessons that Sukkot has to share with us, and its closeness, the timing that it has after Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, I don't believe is accidental. As I was walking the other day, this came clear in my head. We know that Sukkot comes 5 days after that Sukkot comes 5 days after Yom Kippur. And as Yom Kippur holds before each of us this exhausting list, the vidoy, the confessional, of all the things that we failed at and all the things that we were supposed to have done. This enormous list that we're compared against and held to, this examples of excellence in human character and ethics. And then Sukkot comes 5 days afterwards. And I think what Sukkot is trying to tell us is take a breath. Sometimes good enough is good enough. You don't have to kill yourself to be the person that you are, which is not an argument to keep trying to be better. But it is an idea that sometimes the better in us is right there already. It's no surprise that each of the great biblical characters, all of them, were broken, failing human beings. To a person, they each were beset and besieged by tremendous personal difficulties. Abraham in the relation with his children, Isaac in the relation with his wife and his children, Jacob in his relation with his neighbors, his wives, and his children, Moses, his relationship with his sister, with his children, with his wife, with the people that he led. I can go on and on. You know the stories as well as I do. And yet there are heroes. To be human is not to be perfect. To be human is to want to be better. But on Sukkot, I think, we're taught and hopefully inspired to remember that good enough is also good enough. Chag Sameach.